Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jake Friedman, and I serve as the Senior Coordinator at the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing at Arizona State University. Thank you so much for joining us today for Only the Beginning, Arizona's Study Committee on Missing and Murdered Indigenous People with Representative Jennifer Jermaine, April Ignacio, Debbie Manuel, and Dr. Traci L. Morris, presented as part of the NEA Big Read. NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. The images you saw in the opening slideshow were courtesy of Arizona Public Media, Arizona Central, the Arizona Daily Independent, and the Arizona's statewide study in partnership with the HB 2570 Legislative Study Committee from the Research on Violent Victimization Lab at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. The song you heard was a song for redemption by Tanaya Winder from her album For Women and Girls on Fire. Before we move into more formal introductions, I'd just like to provide a brief land acknowledgement and go over a few technical components and points of process for today's event. While we're currently gathered together in this virtual space from many different parts of the world, we would like to speak to where the Piper Writers House and our Creative Writing Center reside on the Tempe campus at Arizona State University. The Piper Writers House and Arizona State University's 4 campuses are situated on the unceded ancestral lands of the Acamel Odhum, Pima, Pipash, Maricopa, and many other Indigenous peoples. We recognize the original stewards of this land and honor those living here today, including the Gila River Indian Community, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, the Pascua Yaqui Tribe, and the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation. Indigenous lives, knowledge, and stories have been rooted here long before the university came to be. They remain central to the past, present, and future of this land and to the Piper Center's current mission and literary communities. For this event, we're going to spend probably the first 30 to 45 minutes in moderated conversation and really try to have a dialogue and a conversation throughout the event with audience questions and they're just questions, excuse me, not Q&A, with audience questions throughout. So while you're welcome to use the chat feature to share thoughts and comments throughout the presentation, please use that Q&A feature to ask questions of the panelists. If you are using the chat, please make sure that you select all panelists and attendees so that other folks can see your comments if you would like them to. You can also like and comment on other people's questions too, which helps us determine which ones are the most popular in the group. Questions will be read by Traci throughout and kind of woven into the conversation from there. I'd also point out that subtitles are being provided automatically by Zoom, which you can view or hide using the closed captioning button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please note that this event is being recorded and live streamed. You should be able to rename yourself. Feel free to do that at leisure. I'd also like to let you know that the Piper Center is committed to creating a safe and welcome environment for all of our community members to enjoy our programming, learn from each other, and participate in creative writing and literary arts. As such, we ask all individuals to be respectful of each other's thoughts, opinions, ideas, and beliefs. Bullying, aggressive behavior, or other actions that deny the rights of individuals are unacceptable, will not be tolerated, and could result in removal from the space. If you experience or observe any behavior that violates this policy, please contact a Piper Center staff member immediately, myself through the private chat or text. Together, we can create a climate that's safe for all. If you do run into any technical challenges as well, you can send me a private message or text again at 240-593-1757. I will be dropping all of that in the chat shortly as well. With all of that out of the way then, I'd like to introduce Dr. Traci L. Morris of the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University, who we have the great honor of hosting here today along with our panelists. Dr. Traci Morris is the Executive Director of the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University and is a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. Under her leadership, the AIPI has grown and diversified its service to Indian country, providing policy analysis, tribally driven research, and economic development capacity building, and working with such Indian country partners as NFAOA, AISES, and the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. In her work at both ASU and prior, Morris has worked with Native American nations, tribal businesses, Native American nonprofits, written a college-accredited curriculum, and has advocated for digital inclusion at the Federal Communications Commission and on Capitol Hill. Dr. Morris also has 2 to 3 more paragraphs that are honorable and illustrious, and in the interest of time, we will simply express some gratitude. Please drop in the chat maybe where you're coming from, right? Where your own home is today. And please welcome Dr. Traci Morris.
Chukma, Hachi Chokmata, Sahocha Foat, Traci Morris, Chikasha Seya. Hi, I'm Traci Morris. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this. Thank you for the great work my fellow panelists are doing, and I'm assuming a lot of folks in the audience as well. I'm joining you from downtown Phoenix, so pretty much the same general area as Tempe in a lot of ways and such. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover, and I want to hear from my fellow panelists, and about this super important subject that impacts so many of us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I have some questions that I'm going to ask them, but I'm also going to make sure that we lead that conversation in a way that is bringing out more information than me talking when I'm done with this part. And towards the end, I'll make sure that we talk about some ways that you and the audience can get involved and be part of the solution. It's a hard subject. We recognize that, but we must talk about it. But we can also talk about the solutions and what we do next so that no more families have to deal with this. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first question for our panelists. It is helpful to see you all. Representative Jermaine and Debbie, would you please? Thank you. It's like I like to see your reactions when I ask the questions, And so I'm going to start off by, identifying the problem a little bit here. We all know this is going to talk about some specific reactions to solve this issue, but the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, which is what it really is, not just women and girls, it's people, we hear a lot about it, but I don't think we can wrap our arms around how big it really is and how many it impacts. But here's a few stats that'll get us going as identifying the issue. Native women are subject to sexual abduction, stalking, and other forms of violence at egregious and extraordinarily disproportionate rates. And within their lives, 1 in 2 Native women has experienced physical violence by a partner, at 5 times higher than women who are white and the highest rate of any racial group. Even though we in Indian country only represent 2% of the national population, we're 40% of the sex trafficking cases, which is a citation from the National Congress of American Indians. Why? So to my panelists, why are Native women subject to such higher rates of violence? And maybe you all can discuss what the causes and some of the circumstances and such as setting up why we're talking about this. Feel free to jump in. I want to hear, all of your stories.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morris. And I think the biggest thing to note is a lot of what we are seeing with missing and murdered Indigenous people is crime of opportunity. In remote rural areas, people don't have access to cell phone service. They don't have access to broadband. And it takes longer for law enforcement and emergency medical services to arrive on scene. And that's compounded by a lot of factors, not just our digital connection, but also the fact that roads are not paved or they wash out in the rain or in the snow. And we're looking at cross-jurisdictional issues where federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, Section 638 law enforcement, you've got county law enforcement, you've got state law enforcement, in some cases you've got some municipality law enforcement, and it creates just a jumbled mess of hot potato who's in charge of this jurisdiction. And that was one of the big things that we looked at with our study committee was how do we get all these people to talk to each other so that we can start cutting down on some of this confusion and start easing some of these jurisdiction issues.
Indeed, I do think that we don't realize, I think the larger population doesn't realize just how rural it is, especially lawmakers back east, the federal lawmakers, they don't realize how rural it is an Indian country. And I think it's unfathomable. It was prior to the pandemic, unfathomable that we were disconnected at the disproportionate rates that we are, and how much impact that could have on something as simple as 911, you know, or Amber Alerts, things that we take for granted when we live in the urban areas. They just don't exist in areas. But also just data erasure, you know, whose jurisdiction is whose because of the federal process and recognition of tribes. I mean, you're right. I think that folks don't even realize how much that plays. And we saw it again with COVID as well, the data erasure of our losses at COVID. People would go into the hospital, they would go into the hospital Indigenous and come out white because, like me, I don't necessarily look Native. If I went into a hospital, unless my husband was there saying, no, she's Native, I would come out white. And that's an issue. And that's the same issue. Don't we see that as well?
We do. We see racial misclassifications within our law enforcement databases and within our hospital databases. And I come up against the same things, Dr. Morris. I present white. My father is Native American. My mother is white. Even going back through 6 generations of lineage within my tribe, everybody had light colored eyes. And that was something that was noted within our clan, within our lineage. And it's something that's even noted as far back as the Lewis and Clark journals, where they came across the light-eyed tribe. That was my lineage.
I would like to add that some of the stereotypes that exist in our media are also challenges that we have to face. Too often, Native women are romanticized, you know, this long flowing hair kind of thing. And if it's jewelry, if it's the romanticizing that we do with, you know, our culture in so many ways that can create those opportunities, like, oh, you know, without thinking of women as people, or, you know, treating them humanely. Instead, women are being objectified. And so this media portrayal really decreases the safety for the women that, you know, that are anywhere in rural, remote, or urban Arizona. I think that's a conversation that we've talked about, and I feel like even our younger girls are portrayed as, you know, as individuals that just can be taken without, you know, thinking. So it really increases safety issues.
Well, you're absolutely right, and it's historically been the media, but now that media includes, of course, you know, online places as well, and that, you know, a generation ago that didn't even exist. So it's very important to note that we see that hashtag throughout social media, that representation matters, and these stereotypical images absolutely have play a huge impact in that. So given all of these things that we've started to bring up, as you know, we've been identifying what the issues are. So let's take a look at the background and history. And while missing and murdered Indigenous peoples has been an issue for centuries, of course, we do know that, there's really been a movement in recent years, and this has reached a milestone in visibility. I think some of it has to do with some of the national things happening also as well. But in our state, this was really led with Representative Jermaine's introduction of House Bill 2570, which eventually formed the study committee that I think you both mentioned at a certain point here in spring 2019. So I'd love to hear from both of you on what the actions and efforts leading up to this legislation were, in both within Arizona and beyond, and how did legislators and the legislature and community members build and sustain such momentum for this movement?
Yeah, and I think it's important. Thank you so much, Dr. Morris. I think it's important to acknowledge that the original driver of this issue in Arizona, as far as our legislature is concerned, was former Representative Winona Benally from the Navajo Nation. And she laid the groundwork with many years of community meetings before we introduced this bill. And also acknowledging Dr. Abigail Echohart's work up at the Urban Indian Health Institute and the Canadian study that predated our bill really laid the groundwork for us to be able to go through the Arizona legislature all the way to the governor's office and say, this is a real problem that deserves real attention and real resources. And we can be a leader on this in the United States of America. And we can really look at it from a holistic point of view, from a victim-centered point of view. How do we solve these problems? Because they are solvable.
Debbie?
Yeah, and I think that I always commend, the women in our communities for, not just talking about the issue, but actually taking action. And so we always commend those women, if it's in ceremony or if it's, in helping family members, they're taking a stand and they're doing something about it. And so when I think about the mobilization that had to happen and to support our legislators, Benali and Jennifer Jermaine, we really had to think about how do we do that. But when it came down to it, we had to reach far and wide into communities around Arizona, all of the counties, all 15 counties, and find women who had these stories. And we were very mindful about the fact that we could trigger memories or emotions, hurtful, so much. And I think that made it a little more challenging is because it was a delicate situation. And how do we honor their stories without creating more emotional trauma? So as time went on, we would connect with women in different ways, if it was through social media, email, telephone, but we asked them to come. We needed their presence in the galleries. We needed their presence in the committee hearings. There was so much more. And as we looked around, we looked for opportunities to hear stories. And we were kind of nervous, at our first committee hearing, because we needed a story. We know that facts and data will raise eyebrows, but those stories will really change the lives. And we needed that to happen. So in pulling it together, as a social worker, I'm often taught ethically that not to center any attention around myself. It's always about the people we're serving. And at the late hour, I decided to talk about my mom's story. My mom, Frances, who went missing for a week, and fortunately we were able to bring her home. But it was her story and talking about what happened to her within our communities, and how she was victimized, sexually assaulted, and what happens to the family when this happens to women. And it was such a powerful opportunity to share that. But even prior to that is getting information from our family, permission from our family to talk about it. And I was grateful that everyone in our family agreed that it was a very appropriate. So bringing women together from around Arizona with a story, a real story, and uncovering the strength and courage that we had to do that. And then, moving through the process, making sure we talked with people in the hallways, elevators, on the courtyard, making sure we were going between both the Senate and the House, and letting our legislators know that this was very personal. It was really affecting all of us in different ways. And so honoring those community members who traveled, hours at a time to get there is really important. We had, on a cultural side, we had some spiritual runners who ran while we were in hearings, who offered prayers and made offerings. I think those were really powerful pieces of what we did, and not something that you would normally hear in a body among legislators. So mobilizing people to come together was really important. The men that came forward, we had a handful of men who were constantly present and reassuring us that they're with us, and that was important. So it took the whole community coming together, consistently, using the RTS system. We can talk about that later, but there's so many pieces that created this movement.
I think that you make a a point that I want to expand a little bit more on this. You said mobilizing people to come together. And I think we need to recognize what an accomplishment that is within state and tribal politics. Because as many people may not be aware, but some may be aware that tribes have a relationship with the federal government. We're part of the family of governments. And we often, it's not state jurisdiction in the same way, which has created a lot of the problems, but certainly with jurisdictional issues and such. And it's also a history that is fraught politically with state tribal relations. States often ignore tribal issues, and historically they have. So I think for me, the impact of seeing the coming together of state and tribal in this way, and we're seeing it now replicated in other states, which is phenomenal, which is building the I feel like the momentum for things like the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, which is now past the House and on to the Senate. So I think we should not take lightly the idea of coming together and the power that brings, even working within our states as well as federally. I think that was a really important point that is often overlooked in politics. It doesn't happen. It's amazing.
Through land-based tribes all on the same side of something, and to be
True.
working together. And we got the first ever grants for victim services from our state to our tribal governments through this program. So we actually got some funding for our tribes for victim services, and we're hoping to do a lot more with that.
I feel like, our approach was very diverse in a lot of ways, and we all had to come together and figure out how to work together. We all come in with different ideas, values, and perceptions of what the issue is, and it was amazing to sit in our subcommittees to problem solve and come up with solutions that we believe would work. And the diversity of those professionals really helped. We were able to hone in on things. Sometimes we would run across a speed bump. One of the major speed bumps we had was the pandemic. That was huge. We were really off to a great start, reaching and connecting to communities, having these meetings take place in the actual tribal communities with real families, who are dealing with real issues. And then all of a sudden, all of that came to a screeching halt. So we did what we could to problem solve in the time that we had. And even despite the barriers we were facing, each one of us found ways to overcome those and push even, hard on one end, and the other end. It's like, okay, let's give and take, let's compromise in this situation, see how we can work this. And I'm really, really honored to have seen how everyone worked and pulled together. I think that was powerful, and that's all about coming together. We could have resisted, we could have chosen to take sides or, not be a part of it, but somehow in some way we ended up all coming together and created some meaning out of it. And especially for the families that we were connecting to for interviews.
Yeah, and I know that when Senator Victoria Steele and I were sitting down to write the bill and to designate who was going to be sitting on the committee, we had multiple people tell us, this committee is too big, it's too cumbersome, you're not going to be able to get anything done. But we looked at it as Indigenous women going, no, all of these voices are important, these voices are vital, they need to be at the table with official seats on the committee.
So let's talk a little bit about the committee. I know that House Bill 2570 details a number of specific goals for the study committee. We've talked sort of about some of the impact a bit, but the idea was to conduct a comprehensive study around missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, and to establish methods and tracking and collecting data and reviewing policies and practices for child welfare and policing, et cetera. So could we talk some about the purposes of the committee and how that worked, and from the more data side? What is it you needed to get out of the committee? Stories complement the data. We need both, we know, in Indian country. So talk to me more about what you hope to get out of it, those sorts of things, could you?
Yeah, so really one of our biggest goals was to find where the gaps exist. We needed to identify the gaps so that we could solve the gaps. And one of the biggest gaps that we found is that there is no standard reporting mechanism for missing persons in the state of Arizona. So a lot of these cases don't exist anywhere within law enforcement databases because it's not a crime for an adult to go missing. So one of the things that we're really working on is making sure that there's a standard intake form so that when somebody calls, there's at least an incident report filed. So that in the case that something horrific happens in the end and they find a body, that family then can go back and access the victim compensation fund because they have that initial incident report within the first 24 hours.
The other thing that I think that we uncovered working together was defining what missing and murdered Indigenous women is, because we have, take it back a few decades, you could say missing and murdered Indigenous women. But today, we often will acknowledge and respectfully acknowledge the pronouns that people identify with, between gender, and even when it comes to the larger population, when we talk about people, there's so many different ways we could have approached it, and we kept doing that. We kept going to the bigger picture, but then we had some team members who constantly remind us, this is what we're tasked with, this is the job. And so we had to take all of what we had and try to focus in one area so that we could do more with this particular area, and it would lay the groundwork and the foundation for other practices who maybe worked with children or worked with teenagers or with men or boys. So we had to really take it down to a narrow focus so that we could do a better job in the end. And I remember sitting in the room when we were having that meeting, and there was a lot of work that went into creating that definition and getting it passed by our entire committee. So that was a huge win for us.
So you've created a definition for missingness, which it seems so obvious that it would exist. I know when I was seeing the data come out of, the raw data when we were working on parts of the report, that was really staggering to me. I knew some of the other issues, but how do you not have a definition? So the fact that you could come together and create one, but there are some other things too, like methods for tracking and collecting data, right? Reviewing policies and procedures and things like that. Can you talk about some of those issues as well? Because I think they're equally important.
Yeah, one of the big issues that we found as well is all of our tribes can't access some of the crime databases. They don't have legal permission to access them. So making sure that we are uploading information and transmitting information to databases that are accessible not just to our state law enforcement, but to our tribes, to our counties, and to neighboring states. Because we know many of our tribal nations cross state borders, they cross international borders. My tribe crosses the international border with Canada. The Pascua Yaqui and the Tohono O'odham Nation cross the international border with Mexico. And these are crimes that don't honor borders. They don't stop at borders. And if we're limiting who has access to these missing person case informations, then law enforcement in other areas can't help us.
And I know that we also saw that this sort of impacted my area of research, which is broadband access. We also, not all tribes have the access, as we've seen demonstrated again with COVID, which seemed to shine a light on all these things. But, tribes don't always have the access to it's more of a digital divide than just broadband, multiple digital divides instead of broadband access. Do they have the Do they have the digital literacy? Do they have the equipment? Do they have the connectivity to upload? I know we heard of some tribes that were recording some of this on spreadsheets, not even a form.
Some tribes were using Excel sheets, and we had massive, large municipal police agencies that did not even have a checkbox for Native American as far as racial classifications go. And we're not even talking about delineating within the tribes. We're talking about one checkbox that says Native American as far as your racial background.
I want to say that the one thing that one of our team members uncovered was, reaching out to the coroner's office and learning the extensive history of people who were, how do I say this respectfully, who were not given a chance to go home, and that was really alarming, extremely alarming. So this box that we're talking about is very important because it creates the process that law enforcement needs to figure out how do they send notification. They do notification locally, but when it comes to a tribal member, we need to do notification at the door of the nations and let them know, your family is here, or a family member, and work and resolve that with the tribal members and getting their loved one home. I think, and there was the pushback, well, maybe they didn't want to be found, that's something that tribal members, if they leave their home, sometimes they want to live in the urban areas, on their own, and that's an option too. That was a real conversation we had. And then some really deeper points that were made is, how do you identify families who are transgender? How do we ensure that those choices that person made were honored? So there was a lot of issues that we grappled over, but we had to figure that out. We had to have honest conversations about what that meant for the people that were there. And then be able to help answer questions for victims, help the law enforcement answer questions for victims, or detectives, or the Attorney General's office. There was a lot that went into it. So what we believe was, just a few procedural steps that needed to be changed. It actually, it pinpoint all of the issues in all of these different systems.
It sounds to me that it's something, I think of the things I see in other areas is just a lack of understanding of Indian communities, of tribal communities. When you're talking about folks living in the urban communities, but going, they need to get back home, people don't realize that our communities are very mobile, very mobile. We're traveling to work in one area, but we're going back home on the weekends and such. And that's just a natural fact of life in Indian country. It's not that they didn't want to go home. It's called economic. It's called their family is there. Maybe they're in school, many reasons. So I think of those sorts of things, which is just a simple not understanding our communities, for one thing. I think of those sorts of things. We definitely need, there's always opportunities. How shall I phrase it? There are always opportunities for education of folks about our communities and how we're different. That's all. We have a lot of similarities. People are people, but our communities function a little differently. And I think there's also a lack of understanding of just what it means to be Indigenous and how we are part of that family of governments. It's not a racial classification. It is a legal classification to be American Indian. It is a legal classification based on tribal sovereignty, based on the fact that we have treaty rights that predate the existence of the United States, that are honored by the United States. So I think those sorts of things, and I think indeed that was one of the findings, or one of the recommendations that came out of the study, if I recall correctly, was some sort of, some training for folks. So
I think
if I recall.
Yeah, extensive training for different folks is important. One of the things that comes to mind is the fact that we we also recognize that trying to put all of these thoughts into a very simple sentence, but we learned it took so much just for us to it was we just tapped into a sliver of the things we needed to do. This all of these systems are so large and complex, and a lot of the people, the personnel that work in these departments often don't come from Arizona. They've moved here, so they don't know tribes or they don't know the history of tribes. And so that itself was something that, I know for a fact that, there's some state employees who just moved here and they're not familiar with tribes and they don't know how to, I think there's a lot of internal fears that they might experience about reaching out, but they also have the internal procedures that they have to follow within the state system. So there's so many barriers that the personnel face themselves. And that's just being really diplomatic about the process. So, but our sliver was just very, very small.
Yeah, and I think to really underscore what Debbie is saying, we do have a bill that is still moving this legislative session. It's House Bill 2384, and that's the expansion of the Arizona Police Standards and Training Board to include a member of the tribal nation, just so that we can bring that level of knowledge and of the complexity of the issues that come with jurisdiction to the highest levels of state government and to the highest levels of designing our law enforcement strategy and our law enforcement training, so that that knowledge is inherent within that board.
I think that answers the question that we have in the Q&A is what can non-natives do to support these initiatives and to do better to support tribal communities is creating those opportunities where Native Americans can serve on these boards, ensuring that we do have Native voices at the table, that we have representation at those tables. Those are really important. And those, I think when these commissions are recruiting, it's really important to ensure that they're actively recruiting within tribes, either in their counties and their districts, or ensuring that those voices are included.
And we'll definitely talk some more about that towards the end in terms of, next steps and calls to action and such. I want to shift gears a smidge because one question I don't want to forget to ask is the idea of community impact. The report's really careful to emphasize that crimes have rippling and cascading effects. And if anybody hasn't seen it, there it is, probably reversed on the screen. But that has rippling and cascading effects in the community, especially within the context of so many matrilineal societies. That question really makes me think about, it leads me first to the idea of the overarching concept of where we got to all the panels that the Piper Center is putting on in the context of the Roundhouse. I've recently read the Roundhouse. I hadn't read it. I've read a lot by Louise Erdrich, but I had never read that. And it was, that question was particularly acute in the Roundhouse novel. The rippling and cascading effects within the community were really dramatized in a way that were, it was really overwhelming. It's like a 12, 13-year-old kid over one summer and how his family changes because of the impact of this from really a kid's point of view. So can we talk more about, or talk a little bit in depth, I think, because it's very important to talk about this, about the consequences and impacts that communities experience and why this is such a fundamental issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Morris, for that question. And I'm really grateful for the Roundhouse and for everything that it covers, because it pretty much mirrors my grandfather's life. My great-grandfather went missing from a New Deal work site in Yellowstone in the 1930s, and my grandfather ended up an orphan and in Indian boarding school at age 10. And from Indian boarding school at age 17, he went straight into World War II. So from age 10 to age 21, he was separated from his entire family.
Mm.
And the rippling effect that that had on our family and the lifelong trauma that he carried with him, not knowing where his father was and what happened to his father, and how that person just suddenly went missing from his life. And our family is lucky because we did end up finding his body. We don't have answers as to what happened to him, but we do know where he is and where he is buried, and we have some sense of closure. But it created a lifelong rippling effect within my grandfather's life, and the choices that he made moving off the reservation into an urban community had a rippling effect on my father's life and then on my life. So we're talking about generations of rippling effects.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that Debbie has a similar story with her family.
I think for me, it took me a long time to realize I was in that ripple effect. I losing a mother at the age of 3 pushed me into a system of all these transitions. I was in kinship care with an aunt who was struggling with alcohol addictions, and living in that environment was difficult. And then the courts coming in, and my older sibling letting the courts know that I needed to have better care. So I remember the clear as day talking to the judge, and the judge asking me, who do you want to live with? I was 9 years old, and they're asking me who I want to live with, and I didn't know anybody. The child care systems never told me, this is your aunt, this is your grandpa, these are your relatives, not knowing. And I think that created a lot of confusion. And I remember those words, and I think as time went on, I regretted every word I said because I didn't know. I was a 9-year-old kid who was answering questions to a judge, and it created all kinds of issues. But going into more circumstances where family was taking care of me, where I dealt with different forms of abuse, from mental, psychological, emotional, financial abuse, and then finding the words to tell my school counselor that where I'm living is not safe, and I will run away from home if you make me go home today. Not understanding what run away was, but because I heard my friends saying it, I used that as a way to find safety. Ending up in the principal's care because there was no foster home available to take me in. There was no group home. And then finally ending up in a foster family who was only licensed to care for infants, but they made an exception with me because they thought I wasn't a bad kid. So I went through so much. And so when I think about kids, I think about the struggles that they face, the lack of resources when it comes to families, or conversations that will help them find out who these family members are, that there's a caseworker there watching these kids, checking in with these kids, because they just kind of left me with family, just assuming because they're family, I would be fine. But through the process, it really introduced me to different forms of trauma that later, when I went into my professional career as a social worker, I had to unravel a lot of that and come to terms with it and realize that this started because somebody killed my mother. A few people killed my mother. And so when I think about children today, it impacts children in so many different ways. And I think within tribal systems, there's very little opportunities for kids coming out of foster care to be taken into transitional care. So we have these kids who are outgrowing foster care systems, and they don't have a place to go. So they're having to their starting line for success is very different than kids who do have strong, active family members. I think those are some of the issues that were very clear to me, but it took a long time to figure that out.
Yeah, and I think both of our families' experiences is what really made us want to look at this issue from a victim-centered perspective. And the victim is not just the person who has gone missing and murdered. The victim is the entire family, and the children that are left behind, and what happens to them when they get stuck into the system.
We thank you for honoring us with your stories and appreciate that. And we appreciate that guided you to trying to create a solution. I do want to expand a little bit more on a less personal level and at least acknowledge that there's impacts the cultural impacts and the historic, this becomes part of what we talk a lot about, which we aren't really, it's not formally addressed in the novel. And I don't think I can't remember where it's addressed. I'm sure it is in the study, but this idea of, this historical trauma. This is just one layer of historical trauma that continues. It becomes generational. This is part of the generational carryover of historic trauma. There's other layers certainly to historical trauma, but and then the loss of culture. So you're cut off. Your culture is lost. We're going to experience that. We're experiencing that now with COVID. I keep bringing it back to that, but I just don't think life is going to be the same after COVID. COVID has changed everything. I think it's going to be at the delineating mark going forward. And so you would think about COVID, how many elders died? And that just stops culture and language. The same thing happens with what we're talking about here with MMIWG, is this loss of connection when somebody goes into a system, an external system. This loss of elder when somebody is missing or murdered. And I just want to bring that up because I don't think it's not something that happens I don't think as prominently in other communities in the United States. I'm certainly not downplaying that other folks experience this, but when you're talking of perpetual cultures that have been here in this place and other places in the U.S. for, many generations, 35 plus generations is what Secretary Holland is using for her history in New Mexico. But it's a really concrete way to think about how long we've been here as Indigenous people. So when you disrupt that in these ways, do you all have any thoughts about the disruptions to culture and historic trauma on a whole for communities?
I think about when we look at societies, some societies are patriarch in a positive sense. And then we have the matriarch systems. Navajo, for instance, is their clanships, their homes, their land are passed through the women. And I recall, and I'm sharing this respectfully, when we had one of our meetings during our visit to Tuba, a woman had come and shared how she had lost her grandchild and how she had lost her child, and then how it impacted one of the siblings who was a male. And I thought to myself, how difficult this must be for the entire family, because often we lean on our grandparents and our elders for those teachings, for ceremony, for leading our families. And here is this grandmother who is distraught, and how can she lead her family when she's dealing with such grief and confusion and uncertainty in her life? And I think while it might be, while she might feel like she's burnt out from trying to figure out where and everything, how to solve things, there's people who also give up in those situations. Is how do we continue to be there? The resources kind of diminish after a while, not just resources in financial or community resources, but even in emotional resources to be able to be there for families who are suffering in that way. And I think her story taught me so much about how do we ensure that matriarchs in our families are honored, and that we find ways to rotate resources and care for them when they're experiencing this kind of this kind of trauma. And I can see how that would happen throughout different communities. Navajo Nation story was just one of them, but there's so many that we hear where women are dealing with violence at varying degrees, and that work that needs to happen with them really needs to be meaningful and intentional. And not, not see them as, okay, this is a case that I have today. It's actually very intensive work that needs to be done with matriarchs.
Yeah, and I think to that point too, making sure that we're putting in the systems and structures to support that work, to be there for the longer term, and to make sure that we're providing the proper wraparound services. So many people don't understand what it's like to lose a family member in that way. And a lot of it is also, we need to break some cultural taboos. So many of our tribes have had this cultural taboo where you don't talk about things. You don't talk about what happened to your aunt who's gone missing. You don't talk about what happened to your murdered grandfather. You don't talk about what happened to your missing child. And we can't heal if we just stuff it inside and brush it under the rug and pretend like it didn't happen. And I think that we're seeing some shifts along generational lines, especially with our tribal youth councils, really putting together massive social media campaigns saying, hey, I saw this truck parked at the Circle K. It does not belong in our community. Keep a lookout for it. And just really elevating the topic to say, as a community, let's come together and let's be safe and let's make sure other people are safe. And how do we start to solve these problems?
So then, those are some of the cultural things. Let's talk a little bit and move back. I'm going to circle back to the bill, the HB 2570, because I'd like to talk a little bit about the recommendations across numerous sectors. The report provides 66 specific recommendations. Thanks for counting them, Jake. I hadn't really counted them. I knew there was a lot, but I know we're trying to create a policy brief out of 66 policy recommendations right now at the Institute, and it's challenging. But as we think about these recommendations across the various sectors, including victim services and resource allocation, education, law enforcement, data improvement, legislation, many of these emphasize the need for increased access to services, funding, and training within tribal nations. And several bills have been addressed. I know that you're working on, Representative Jermaine. So without getting too into the weeds, because I know our folks are probably listening, aren't probably data and nerds and legislative folks like us, but what are some of the most important or urgent actions that could be taken that are proactive, that can start solving this, that the report talked about?
Yeah, two of the bills that we still have moving in the state legislature this year, House Bill 2099, which is the extension and expansion of our task force. That'll be covered in Senate Judiciary on Tuesday, or not Senate Appropriations on Tuesday. And House Bill 2098, which deals with the reporting requirement for missing children. That one we are still trying to get onto an agenda, but it is still alive and we are still moving. We are waiting on the Senate Judiciary Committee for that bill. So we're hoping that those can get through. We already have one of our recommendations on its way to Governor Ducey's desk, and that is the expansion of the Arizona Health Education Centers to support Indian healthcare and Native health services within Arizona. And that's a workforce training bill to make sure that we have doctors, nurses, social workers, and other healthcare professionals available within our tribal nations and within our urban Indian communities. And that comes in really big because outside of Maricopa County, we have very few forensic sexual assault nurses. And that's a highly specialized area. And it's very, very relevant, especially when we're talking about domestic and sexual violence within our communities and being able to prosecute people. If you can't collect the evidence, you can't prosecute somebody. So we need to have these healthcare professionals within our communities to be able to collect this evidence so that it can be used for prosecution. And pairing that with the changes from the Violence Against Women Act that just passed the House Chamber of Congress, and the extensions to tribal prosecutions for crimes committed by non-natives against natives and on native land would go a long way to helping to solve this problem.
I think for me, a mountaintop view is really to understand how important it is for the governor to recognize these 66 items. And I think about it, it's like, why is that number so large? That number is large because we have never addressed it. You know, you look back 250 years and what happened here in this, you know, in the landscape of Arizona, we have never brought this up. That's why the number is so high. And I think about some of the conversations we had. We were talking about, well, you know, let's ensure that funding is available so that tribes can sign up for these grants, and you know, tribes can do this, this, and this, and this. And I'm thinking that puts the burden back on the tribes again, because for an issue that was created by settlers who came into the state of Arizona, you know, a mountaintop, the most responsible way to address some of these issues. I heard a really great phrase last night when I attended another one of NEA's events, is that you've got to give back until it hurts. You know, our state needs to recognize that this is an issue that was created way back when, and over time it has evolved into something so complex, large, and speaks to that historical trauma. So, you know, we need to see an office created to address this issue. You know, the office can be in place for the next decade, but somehow seriously look at our health systems, our law enforcement, all of the areas that really need this training so that we can address the issue in a really meaningful way. I think for me, I've been on the end of that relationship where you're applying for grants. A lot of tribes don't have, you know, the resources to apply for grants. And then often when you have a state like Arizona who's applying, 22 nations are applying for tribes, and then you have to determine who's going to get that, who has the greatest need. So you find yourself fighting for those monies. Offering a state resource that's available to address those needs is much more, has a lot more integrity, you know, brings integrity to the humanity among women and children who are going missing. So when I think about it, I think about that, and I think that how people can really help us is to ensure that our governor is acting, is doing something meaningful with all of the recommendations, that it's just not sitting there waiting for the next governor to look at. You know, we've got to get started on this.
Yeah, and to really go back to something that Debbie hit on, when we go back to the data, this is not a problem that stops at the borders of our tribes. Mm-hmm. Our greatest number of missing Indigenous people is from metropolitan Maricopa County. That is the greater Phoenix Valley. And that's state, county, and local jurisdiction. That's not tribal jurisdiction. So we need to make sure that everybody's working together, everybody has an understanding of this problem, and that we're coordinating resources. And it is a state problem, it is a county problem, it is a local municipality problem. And everybody has a part of this problem, and we need to solve it together.
Representative Jermaine, I saw a presentation on this, I think it was in 2019 that the Indian Center did, the Phoenix Indian Center, and they had a couple of trainers from one of the police departments talking. And what struck me was that, if I'm correct me if I'm not, but I think they were saying at the time that, especially in our urban areas, that traffickers know that we fall as Indian people in jurisdictional voids, and that we're not tracked, and they already know this about our populations and target us because of that. Is that true? Have you heard that? Can you expand?
Yes. And working with with some of the researchers at ASU and within our sexual and domestic violence nonprofits, we also know that there's a fetish market out there for Native women.
Yeah.
And that further elevates the targeting of Native women and girls for these sex trafficking rings. But the fact that we do fall into that jurisdictional void, and that's where we're pushing with Congress for an elephant fix to the Tribal Law and Order Act, make sure that prosecutions can happen, and to really make sure that those fixes are in the Violence Against Women Act that kind of overlay all jurisdictions so that we can make sure that people have some sense of protection within the law.
So this is a fix that's the family of governments. This is a federal fix with VAWA. This is a state fix with this bill and some of the action steps in subsequent bills that you've outlined. This is a tribal government fix. Everybody needs to be at the table, and not just tribal governments, but tribal community members as well, and urban community members as well. Because if we don't, we can't solve it because of all these cracks because we haven't been talking.
Yeah,
we need a holistic fix.
The cracks exist because we've been working in silos. And when we break down the silos and we start working together, we can find where the cracks exist and how to fix them.
Absolutely.
I think even here in the urban area, I've heard a number of stories. I mean, I think because we sit on the task force, we get these alerts a lot more frequently. And right here in the boundary of the Salt River Indian community, we are finding that Walmart's targets, these parking lots are being targeted. Just the other day, we heard of one of my former colleagues who was walking down the road to go pick up her vehicle. I mean, these things are real. It's happening, and and this is in the urban area in broad daylight. We really have to do a lot of safety and education with our neighborhoods, and in a really informal way, so that we're all watching out for each other. I think aside from the federal, the state, the county, the tribes,
the individual.
It has to happen in our neighborhoods too.
Yep. Absolutely. I think I've heard that as a solution for so many things. We just don't know our neighbors anymore. And we need to know who belongs and who doesn't, whether that's online or, who belongs in our online neighborhoods, but also who belongs in the neighborhoods around us as well. I think we all have some responsibility to solve this. So to that, I want to shift gears a little bit, and then we're going to open it to Q&A. So please prep your questions. You've got a rapt audience here. But so this is a complex, difficult subject to wrap your mind around. So I'd like to make sure that our audience leaves with an idea of what they can do, a call to action, how they can be a part of the solution, not just Native folks, but all of our allies as well. How can people stay informed? How can they participate in the process? Who should they be turning to? Who are the organizations? How can we positively support this work?
So right now, especially during the pandemic, the best way for people to participate, at least at the state legislature, is through our Request to Speak system, which is an online community. And we've got a great indivisible group called Civic Engagement Beyond Voting. And I believe the link will get dropped into the chat, where you can go. They've got tutorials on how to use the system, video tutorials, and they will help you get signed up for the system. And that's a great way where people can add their comments. Right now with the state legislature, we are doing committee testimony through Zoom. So you'd be able to sign up through that system to be able to testify through Zoom in committee hearings, which has done a lot of really great things, opening up the opportunity for our tribal communities. I know that when I was pushing through the healthcare bill, we had the director of Tahana Atam's healthcare system dial in through Zoom, and he was able to testify He would not have been able to drive down to the Capitol to be able to do that. But because we're in virtual mode, he was able to testify live in the state legislature about how this will affect the community within his tribe.
The request to speak system is really powerful. It helped us back in the spring of 2019 when we were working on this bill. We had we encouraged everyone who arrived at the site to register in the lobby. It looks like a ATM machine. You need your driver's license and I think your voter card. I signed up so long ago, I don't quite remember what it requires, but your email address. So you just go in and you type in your name, your email address, you log in as a new person, and then it'll ask you for your ID number, and it's free. It's so accessible, it's free, and it's pretty powerful tool because once you get logged in and you go to look for a bill, I just went to look at House Rep Jermaine's bills last night, and to make sure that I had submitted my support for it. So I went in and I could see all of the thumbs up for the bill that she has. It was pretty significant. And you look at the other side of it, for those who oppose it, there was probably like 7 names. But what happens is when they go into committee hearings and all of our legislators are looking at this, they're looking at how many thumbs ups they have, which is green. It's like, oh, okay, that's good. But I fear what might be happening is that our Native American legislators who propose bills are not hearing back from our communities and not getting the support on the bills that they're proposing, which are very important for if they're for education, safety, health, changing a law that needs to be tweaked slightly or modernized. I think those are really important. So when we don't hear from our own tribal members, it's taken as nobody cares. And we don't ever want that to happen. If our legislators are doing the work and pulling in staffers to write something up, we really need to take a moment to just go in there and show our support and try to find ways to make ourselves available to speak to that in a very concise and knowledgeable way. I think that's really important. So it works. I've seen bills that have been passed because of what the legislators are seeing in the hearing. And it's free. Please, it's free.
So you've both spoken to how Indigenous folks can have their voices heard and be a part of this process. But we have some terrific allies in the midst because we've got a couple of really great questions from allies that are related but different. So first is the one that came in earlier. What can non-natives do to support these initiatives, better support these initiatives and tribal communities themselves? And then one specific to research. How can non-native researchers either conduct research or support these research issues? So can we chat a bit about how we can engage our allies and give them some solutions as well, because folks want to help.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest ways that allies can help is using your voice to elevate the issue. These are real issues that affect real people within our community. And for so long, it was ignored by the mainstream media, ignored by people who are non-native, and not necessarily because of a nefarious motive, but just because you didn't know. You didn't know what was going on. And I think we saw a big change a few years ago when you started to see Native women getting elected to statewide and national offices. And we brought these issues into those hallways. And so these are real issues that are affecting real people in our real community. And you need to pay attention to them, and you need to pay attention to them now. And there was just a big convolute around media about 3 years ago when this really kind of came to a talking point and really came to a presence within our national media landscape when people started paying attention and saying, oh yeah, that is happening. Oh yeah, I know somebody that happened to. And when we were looking to introduce the bill on the first level, we actually went around to every Indigenous person who works at our state capitol, and 100% of the employees who are Indigenous in our state capitol complex had a tie to this issue. And we had them talk to the people that represent them in our state legislature. They were from all over the state, saying, this is an issue that is actually happening in our communities, and it's an issue that directly affects my family. But making sure that we are engaging and talking to people and having allies who are outside of the communities, recognizing that these are real issues, and supporting them, and supporting the groups that are already doing work on these issues. Supporting
who are those groups?
like
Who are the groups?
Coalition to End Domestic Violence, supporting groups like the Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition, supporting groups like Morningstar Leaders and Indivisible Tohono, who are working on these topics, supporting our tribal victim services departments. A lot of the groups lack financial resources. So even just making a $25 donation to some of these groups makes a huge difference.
I just want to add that, when we create budgets within our programs, or if we are funders or donors, and in that way, I think that's the biggest challenge that we face, because when we look at resources on a federal level or even on a state level, a lot of those resources for operational programming or operations or programming or prevention and education is really limited. And so to answer those questions is, how do you help is ensure that your budgets include funding to address these issues, to ensure that the safety of women is prioritized in the workplace and also in our communities, in our neighborhoods. Our budgets really reflect the values we have as an organization, and often when we have budgets, we don't think about that, or like, how do we increase it? How do we modernize those budgets and even our mission statements? I think that's powerful. We really cannot, prioritize safety enough when it comes to women and girls and people. I think that's really important. The second thing is to ensure that we are connecting with these organizations that were mentioned. They exist in every tribal community. I think that they are there, and they all have expenses like imprinting, or even if they have volunteers, is to give them their volunteers fuel to get from one place to another, even to interview a victim who is dealing with an issue, offering them resources, a safety kit. Safety kits might include things that we take for granted, if we're comfortable in our lives, but they're life and death for victims who are struggling. Making sure that we're supporting those organizations are really important. And there's not one centralized place. There's so many different places. So if you live in one particular county and there's a tribal nation there, I can guarantee you there is a grassroots effort happening there, and they could use that support.
And what about, so Jake is posting, he's posting these different organizations for us. We thank you, Jake. You have been a good host. And so Jake's posting those. And so if I hear y'all right, there's number one, our allies can participate in the legislative process and support things. Two, well, I'm not ranking, but another item that folks can do is they can, as allies, get involved with one of these organizations. And there's monetary support, there's volunteer support, and that will help them be aware of the issues more so. Do we have an urban organization? I would say certainly Phoenix Indian Center is going to be one of these organizations. Shameless plug, I'm the president of the board. So, but there's other organizations as well. I think perhaps
Native Health.
Native Health.
Native American Connections.
The Intertribal Council of Arizona.
Yep. Absolutely.
Has resources and a etymology center that is working on this as well.
Yep.
And we look at places like Hong Wense Consulting, who works with all of our law enforcement agencies on missing persons cases and really helps to try to coordinate some of those case loads.
Okay. And towards that, I'm going to shift just and do an answer to the second part of that question, which was a second question. Somebody asked about research and non-Native researchers supporting research in these issues. I would urge them to work with, to go to perhaps ASU and work with and talk to Dr. Fox at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice in the Watts College downtown, and their research on the Violent Victimization Lab. That would be a great place to start in terms of being helpful in that arena and the appropriate way to do so. So anybody else?
When we're looking at research too, we really do want to make sure that the sovereignty and the rights of tribes are being respected with that, and to really follow the leads of people like Dr. Fox, who have really done it properly and gotten the proper permissions and gone through the proper avenues to
I would agree. And they're welcome to reach out to us at the American Indian Policy Institute as well. We're pretty visible on the web. So we have one more question in the chat, and then we can, I think, probably at that point wrap it up. And I think it's a wide open question, a little bit broader, but the question is, Congressman Marilyn Strickland, Democrat from Washington, is a South Korean-born American, and she was on CNN last night speaking with regard to the recent murder of 6 Asian women in Georgia. And she said that when women of color are murdered, there's usually a nexus between misogyny and racism. Any comments?
I agree. Yeah. We've seen a lot of that, especially when most of what we see with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is coupled with sexual violence. And that underscores to, making sure that we have healthcare professionals and social workers in the communities who are trained to intervene and to head off some of this before it becomes unreversible.
I think the other side of that too is the misperceptions in our society today about COVID, because COVID is such a serious thing.
True.
There's this cloud that constantly misunderstanding stereotypes that believe that this virus, and because of some louder media voices that have shared this message, it's attacking a certain group of people. And I think that can happen also to Natives. There's certain things there's stereotypes out there that say that Natives are they're drunks, or they're this, or they're that, and we get stuck with that no matter what, even within our own communities. And so it's having to teach and unlearn those perceptions when it comes to our community and to our societies. So our hearts go out to Atlanta. I have nieces who are Asian, and they live in Atlanta. So just making sure that no matter where our families are, that we're reminding people to keep our women safe no matter where they're at. So
I wonder how many it will impact in other areas, because in certain areas of Indian country, folks look Asian.
Many of our Native women who are Navajo look like Asian women. And that's something that's real. I know we're going to get ready to wrap up, but I really want to acknowledge Women History Month. And acknowledge, Wainona Benali for bringing this, to the surface, doing all of the work that she committed to, when it came to our communities. That's something, and just want to acknowledge her, the root of the work that was happening during this month. And thank you to Jennifer for taking the baton and carrying that. I think that was amazing. And to many of the legislators there who fight and reach across the aisle to make this happen. And it's amazing to work with all of these women.
Yeah, and to know too that Representative Finale's work has not stopped. Even though she has left the state legislature, she is a prosecutor and she is prosecuting these crimes and is working with us to help make these changes to the federal laws that need to get changed for Indian country.
Yeah.
Any other last thoughts as we do wrap this up that you would like to put out there?
Really, I wanted to thank and acknowledge Abel Ochoa, who did the artwork for the report, and know that this was his final piece that came for us because we did lose him to COVID. And really acknowledging Valora Imas Nashenhoya, who was the Bureau of Indian Affairs Victim Specialist for this area, and who now runs Hung Wednesday Consulting to really help guide us through this jurisdictional maze and through these very delicate victim services issues when it comes to missing and murdered.
And please support all of our grassroots. You know, they're working very, very hard. So just want to give a shout out to all of those volunteers and organizers.
Yeah, and you know, and I can't believe we almost forgot, but I wanted to acknowledge Delegate Amber Crotty and missing and murdered Dene relatives that is happening up in the northern parts of our state. And they are part of our grassroots and they're doing phenomenal work. And we are happy and proud and honored to partner with them.
Thank you both for your time. Thank you both for your tireless and tired efforts. I'm sure you're tired, but thank you for your tireless efforts towards this. I know that it's helpful to be part of a solution than to sit with it. And so it is greatly appreciated, and we acknowledge your work in this area. And thank you for leading us. And thank you for talking to us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, ladies. Have a good day. Thank you, Jake.
Mashki.